Okay, why don't we get started here? Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us for another EI Live K-12 session for students and educators, a series of the Columbia Climate School. My name is Adrienne and I will be facilitating the session today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or are joining us for the first time, we are a newly established school at Columbia University for transdisciplinary climate research. The school marshals the university's strengths in basic and applied disciplines and expands its resources to understand climate and its impact on society. The Climate School is the first new school at Columbia in over 25 years, and it incorporates the entire Earth Institute and the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, along with more than 20 other centers and several hundred people who collaborate among many departments across the university. What we're hoping to do with these EI Live K-12 sessions is to introduce you all to our interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts. These bi-weekly sessions will run throughout the whole semester, and if you'd like any more information about the sessions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Each week we'll focus on a different topic and will be directed towards a certain age range. Today's session is Seeking Climate Justice, Past, Present, and Future. In this session, we will review and reflect on the overlapping socioeconomic, racial, and environmental and climate injustices faced by marginalized communities in the past and present times, as well as identify and address their vulnerability to future risks exacerbated by climate change. We're joined today by Melody, a senior staff associate, and Danny, a program officer. Both are at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. We will have time for questions at the end, so please use the Q&A box as the chat is disabled. The session is also being recorded, and we will send participants a link for the recording after it's ready. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Melody and Danny. Thank you.
Melody, you can go first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Adrienne, for the introduction. And we're looking forward to talking with you about this complicated issue. So like Adrienne said, my name is Melody. I work at Columbia University, which campuses are built on the unceded ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. And so I want to start by acknowledging the Lenni Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a first step to recognize the history of land grabbing and forced displacement that allowed us to live and work where we are. And it's also a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Danny,
Thanks, Melody. And thank you to Adrienne for the introduction. So as a Vietnamese American, I also want to acknowledge that before New York, I was born in Vietnam and then migrated with my family to Houston, Texas, which then belonged to the Sana, Karankawa, Coahuitan, and Atacapa Isha. Apologies for terribly pronouncing these names. And then by Mexico, before the land was taken over by white colonizers who also supported and profited from slavery. And eventually the Texas territory was then inducted into the United States of America, I think in 1845. So I want to acknowledge these peoples and these communities and many, many others throughout the vast areas and lands that now make up the state of Texas, as well as the violence and the injustices that have been inflicted upon them that were not always comprehensively, thoroughly discussed in K-12 histories and history lessons and even beyond. But the land was where when I first came to the US, this is where I lived and learned and studied and got to know the culture and the history and the people. So I wanted to provide that acknowledgement. And I think by acknowledging and understanding the history of where we came from and the piece of land that we come to live and work and study in, I think it's the beginning of understanding better what happened in the past in order to create and think about the solutions for the future. And with that in mind, I think based on the events that have happened in recent years, we now talk more and more about climate justice and racial justice and social justice. But what we notice is that it's often really hard to distinguish and separate and isolate these issues from one another. They all kind of overlap. And so in order to address them, you kind of have to understand where these overlaps are. And then in addressing them, you also have to kind of address all of the issues rather than just one alone. Next. So the reason it all goes back to race in a way. We can't really separate race from environmental and climate and social injustices. According to the nation, race is the most significant predictor of a person living near uncontaminated land, water, or soil. And you can see a lot of the statistics on the slide, so I won't read them. But the reason how come race came to be such a big predictor of environmental climate injustices? You go to the next slide. Let's go back a little bit to history. So I think we're aware of the land grabbing and slavery, so I won't go too much into that anymore. But every step along the way, the policies and the misguided practices kind of help perpetuate the oppression and the action that help limit and marginalize particular communities, especially communities of color. One particular practice was in the 1930s, is called redlining. And what this was essentially was that when the country was the US was starting to build back after the Great Depression and World War I, there was a lot of families seeking to buy homes and establish themselves within neighborhoods in order to get jobs and send their kids to school and build their lives. But the loan providers would mark certain areas that are predominantly Black communities to create more barriers for these families to access the loans, or if they are able to get a loan to purchase the home, it would be at a much higher interest rate than compared to white neighborhoods. And so all of these disadvantages make it harder for Black families to actually own and settle in good neighborhoods. And then from there, it's kind of cascade, and it leads to major wealth disparity that we see today. For every $100 that a white family has, a Black family only have $5.40. So it's not just a few percentages, as you can see, is a huge gap. So that was the 1930s. When you get to the 1940s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created signed this piece of legislation called the National Systems of Interstate Highways, which would envision a network of rural and urban express highways to help connect the country, help people get from to what we now call suburban areas and rural areas into the cities, into factories, into places where they can go to work, and so for goods to be transported across the country to get to places quicker, to actually get to people who are more isolated. It was unfunded until 1956, when President Eisenhower signed this into the Federal Aid Highway Act. But essentially, to build a lot of massive highways, and if you ever driven with your friends or family from one state to another, you see what enormous structures these highways are. So in order to build them, it causes a lot of noise and pollution, and it's very disruptive because that land that now the highways occupied was actually taken away from somebody, or or there were trees and forests that were destroyed in order to build these highways. Can you get to the next slide? And with that, those trees and the nature is taken away, you end up with this concrete, blacktop, flat surface that attract more heat and is very unpleasant to live near or in, in the long term. And during the construction of the highways, predominantly Black and community of colors would be targeted or designated as the areas that would host these highways. So even as Black families, as I mentioned before, try to establish themselves, because it was already hard to own homes and build their businesses and create these very vibrant, rich communities that have trees, that have local businesses, that have vibrant city streets that people can walk down and see their neighbors and hang out and go into the local coffee shop or restaurant or barbers. When you have a highway running through these neighborhoods, it creates these isolations and separation so that it's noisy, it's hard to make a stop, there's a lot of traffic, and so the businesses eventually die out, and the people who are left, they see their home values decrease because it's less and less desirable to live in these areas that are noisy, that polluted, and hotter. And the statistics are very real in cities like Baltimore, Dallas, Denver, Miami, Portland, and New York. Neighborhoods that are poor and have residents of color can be 5 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the summer than wealthier, whiter parts of the same city. And so because of redlining and other forms of systemic racism and discrimination, we see that people of color, communities of color, and those otherwise marginalized by race, class, gender are more likely to reside and work in these areas, and they become more affected in terms of physical and mental health. And Black and Latinos families or people or like LGBTQ people didn't simply settle or choose to live in areas that are undesirable. For example, if you're an LGBTQ individual or a person of color who are trying to find housing and you're denied housing elsewhere, you end up in these areas that are where you are accepted. It is like less desirable, and it doesn't have as nice conditions at other places. And the same people who are like voted for, policymakers who create these legislatures that discriminate and create this very challenging environment, they continue to benefit from being in nicer living because they're buffered, living in areas that have parks, that have green spaces, that are away from the highways and the noise, whatever changes that happen, they are buffered from it, including climate change now. When you see, the temperature being harsher and harsher in the winter or in the summer, or when you have like extreme events like rains or flooding, they're not really impacted as much as these neighborhoods that have an entire history of discrimination against them. Next. And I think that if you're in and around New York State area, you're probably familiar with Central Park, which is a very nice big green space and like a haven that everyone can go to and sit down and relax after like being in the hustle and bustle of New York City. And it's praised by by New York City as well as people around the world as like a very successful case of creating public green space that people can enjoy, that brings a lot of benefits. But it wasn't always the case that, that everyone could enjoy the creation of Central Park. You go next. This area marked here was historically known as Seneca Village, and next, which was a community of mostly many of them whom are homeowners. And majority was Black families, but there were also Irish and other immigrants that came to New York City. And in order to escape the very dirty and harsh conditions of the urbanized area, they chose to settle in this area and build a very nice, thriving community and neighborhood that, just it actually was a way that people could actually build and accumulate wealth and tend to their home and their community. Next. But when the park was created, this land was taken away by eminent domain. So what remains now of Seneca Village is just these signs that you can see around the park. And you can also learn about the history on the website. And you can do a little bit of archive research to find the pieces that have been excavated from the area. But it's all, just remnants of history. You no longer see families or people that used to live in Seneca Village anymore because they have been displaced with their property and land taken away. And next. Now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a room that's been specifically created to showcase Black American as well as African ancestral cultures who have, and it's termed as Afrocentrism, which is kind of optimistically look at how Black and African cultures could thrive and build upon excellence. But the signage that acknowledge, there's a signage that acknowledge the Seneca Village and the land that was taken away, that is now Central Park and the Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then we're looking at these objects displayed in this room, which was also built to resemble the structure that used to be found in Seneca Village. It's kind of ironic because you're looking at this recreation of what used to be there. There are objects to kind of resemble like what a family would live within this room. But it's in a museum, it's a display box where a viewer is looking at this rather than seeing a real family living and thriving within this land. Okay, next. So then it brings us to this kind of question that's like, we have there's preservation, there's land conservation, all of these are very good intention, but a lot of times like the method of how we preserve the land and how we conserve nature, it continues to perpetuate a lot of this type of discrimination that, and a lot of time the people who are marginalized and the people who are displaced are the people who don't have a lot of power or people of color. In the early 1900s, we see President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, wanted to preserve nature, and with the United States rapidly developing into urbanized areas, a lot of lands were already destroyed and burned and and turned into agriculture land. He saw the needs to preserve and conserve the nature, but there's conservation for the people that live in these land, which, as we learned earlier, Native people. But then there's also the settlers and people who want to or who are tired of the cities that they built, and they wanted to go and enjoy themselves in like nature and to hike and to relax and to look at nature rather than live within it. It's interesting, right? Because the people who lived in these lands, maybe they moved from place to place. The intention and the relationship that we have with the land is very different to compared to like traditional land conservation, which means just to mark an area and keep everybody out, or if you're permitted to go in, you're not allowed to forage, you're not allowed to live in these areas. You're only supposed to visit it like a museums, and then you leave. So the first picture that you see here is Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, which used to belong to the ancestral Pueblans. And we're running out of we're running low on a bit of time, so I'm going to try to speed up here. And what you can see there, these structures are called cliff dwellings, which means that, in which, according to the Puebloans people, they wanted to build something that would eventually return back to nature. So that so when the park was built, the people had already left, but we preserved the area with the cliff dwellings within it, whereas the original intention was for it to disintegrate and to return back to nature. So there's already that conflict of how do we live with and within nature rather than preserve nature as a separate means from the place that we live in. And then next. And then another case I want to introduce to you is the Kahusibianca National Park in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is renowned for its biodiversity. Rainforests, all kinds of forests are, kind of acknowledged as where animals are thriving, trees are thriving. All of that biodiversity help host a lot of wildlife, and so we want to preserve it for the nature, but it's also home to people. The area is home to the Batwa people who are highly dependent on the forest for their livelihoods and culture and tradition. So the previous effort to protect this forest have been challenged because by expanding the areas that are preserved, the conservation efforts actually force the displacement of thousands of local people and turning them into conservation refugees and creating a lot of distrust in any kind of conservation initiatives that are proposed. And one organization that have been successful in leading conservation efforts is called Strong Roots Congo. And the way that they are more successful than past initiatives was because they actually put the needs of local people at the center of the strategy, so that they would actually hire local communities to help protect and preserve the land, so that they have income, they have an incentive and support, and that they understand what conservationists are trying to do, and it's actually more profitable to them than to try to poach, kill the animals and try to sell off the parts, or trying to harvest the trees for logging. So that this creates sort of a win-win situation, and more conservationists are recognizing that you can't simply go in and marked a land for conservation without thinking about who lives there or who lives next to it, and understanding the relationship of those people with the piece of land we're trying to protect. And next, I'm going to hand it over to Melody.
Thanks, Danny. So basically, we've seen with the examples that Danny shared, we've seen the impact of building roads or parks on communities that traditionally live there. And we've also seen how important it is, how basically the people that are involved in those decisions are usually not the people from those areas. And so when you start including the communities from that area in the decision-making processes or in the management of these areas, like it's the case for the gorilla conservation, for example, then it takes a whole other approach, and it's usually a lot more sustainable when you include the people from the area. So we're going to go through another example of land appropriation, or rather the impact of making a decision in a land that doesn't belong to us. So this is the example of the Line 3 pipeline, which is a tar sand pipeline that's owned by a Canadian company called Enbridge. It's been operating since 1968, and it runs about 1,000 miles between Alberta and Superior, Wisconsin. And over its history, the pipeline has leaked many times, multiple millions of gallons of oil spills, the biggest one being in 1981 in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. That was the worst inland oil spill in the history of the United States. So according to Enbridge themselves, the company owning the pipeline, the Line 3 has 900 structural anomalies. And so that could be leaks and cracks, and it's old and it's eroding. And as a result, in 2014, Enbridge proposed the construction of a new segment of the pipeline as a replacement of part of the old one, along a different route in Minnesota, which would also increase the volume of oil that could be transported. Obviously, they didn't consult with the people from that land, and so it was met with a lot of resistance from Native American communities and climate justice groups. So let's look at the arguments of those people. First, the new segment was going through the treaty territory of the Anishinaabe people, which would violate their treaty rights. They actually have a treaty that gives them a number of rights, and so that would be completely in violation with that treaty. And it would not only continue to pollute the environment, which the old segment is already doing, but it would also threaten wild rice and the sources of water for the Anishinaabe people by going through some of the untouched wetlands in that territory that the new segment would go through. The other concern is if there's a spill in that new environment, the new segment is crossing so many rivers that if a spill happens at the place where it crosses the river, it's likely to contaminate the entire stream and potentially the entire ecosystem. Another issue was that there was no clear plan from Enbridge about what they would do with the old segment of the pipeline. Would they just leave it here abandoned, which would then likely continue to contaminate the environment, or did they have an actual plan for it? Eventually, the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues is that Line 3 would contribute to more climate change than the entire economy of Minnesota. The Department of Commerce of Minnesota found that the local market does not actually need additional oil from Line 3. And so the whole point of these activists is that we need to decommission the old Line 3 and just transition to a more renewable, sustainable economy and more renewable sources of energy. Unfortunately, over 1,000 people were arrested in this fight against the new segment of the Line 3. They called Biden to revoke its permit and halt the construction of the pipeline, but it was just completed like just a couple months ago, maybe last month. So it has been completed, and Enbridge is now even talking about further expanding their network. So that's just an example where the Anishinaabe people who have been living in that land and who actually have a treaty over that land were not consulted in the process and are the first ones to bear the consequences of that pipeline if anything happens. Another example, but with a happier ending, an example of environmental justice and bad decision making, but where citizens really gathered as a community to fight it, is the example of the Flint water crisis. So Flint is a city in Michigan. And in 2014, the government officials of Flint decided to switch the water source, the drinking water source, from what was the Detroit water system to the Flint River, which is a river that was going through the city of Flint. So something to note is that Flint River, for more than a century, it goes through the river, and it had been the unofficial basically waste disposal site for treated and untreated water from all the local industries, including car factories and meat packing plants and paper mills, etc. It was also receiving raw sewage from the city and then from the waste treatment plant, and then agricultural and urban runoff. So all of that to say that water wasn't very clean. The city decided to save money to switch from the Detroit water system to the Flint River as a source of drinking water. That was in April 2014. And as soon as May 2014, the people of Flint started complaining about water quality, but the government said, no problem, you can keep drinking it. People noticed that the water had a different color, as you can see on the pictures. It was tasting weird, it was smelling weird, it was causing skin rashes and hair loss, but the city said, no problem, you can keep drinking it. In August of the same year, they found E. coli bacteria, so bacteria that's bad for health, in the water. And the government official said, it's okay, you have to boil the water before you drink it, but it's still completely safe to drink. So they still didn't switch back to the old system. In October, General Mills stopped using the Flint water because it was corroding their car parts. So imagine what happens when you drink it if it's bad enough to corrode car parts. Still, the city didn't do anything. In February 2015, they found high levels of lead in the water and in the children of Flint. It took until January 2016 to finally declare the state of emergency for the city of Flint and to distribute proper water to the community. So it took 18 months. For 18 months, the government officials completely ignored the Flint community. But thankfully, the community didn't give up, and they got support from scientists and journalists and doctors and activists. And they eventually managed, it took 18 months, but they managed to put light on the severe mismanagement of that drinking water. And once the case was known, everyone was like, well, how did that even happen in the first place? How is that even possible? And the Michigan Civil Rights Commission concluded that the poor government response of the Flint crisis was a result of systemic racism. So for the record, Flint is 57% Black, 37% white, 4% Latino, and 4% mixed race. So, and more than 41% of the residents live below the poverty line, according to the US Census. So it's just another example of how communities that are marginalized by the way of race, class, gender, are less likely to be taken seriously and listened to by government officials, by people in decision-making positions than others. And so while this specific example is not specifically related to climate, you can imagine that when we talk about the climate crisis, all of these same factors are playing a role. And we can't just look at the impact of climate only on communities to determine who's more vulnerable and who's less vulnerable, because it's the compound effect, the additional effects of all of that that makes some communities more vulnerable than others, more likely to access decision-making power, more likely to access resources or healthcare, etc. So now we're going to switch to the global level, and the exact same questions are happening at the global level when we talk about the climate crisis. We all live on the same planet. We just have one planet. We're all impacted by climate change. Yes. But once again, it doesn't affect everybody the same way. So let's have a look first at which countries are or have been contributing the most to climate change. I'm pretty sure you have an idea about that, but here is one map that shows you the annual carbon dioxide emissions per country. So CO2, or carbon dioxide, is one of the most important greenhouse gases causing climate change. And on the map, you can see that the darker the red, the higher the level of emissions from a specific country. So this is the total amount of CO2 emissions of a country per year. And you can see that China is by far the darkest. So it's the #1 emitter when you look at the total amount of emissions, followed by the United States in second. And then you have other countries like Russia and Canada and Australia, Brazil, a big part of Europe, India. Now, I want to show you another map, because this is not the only way of looking at who's polluting the most or who's responsible for the most greenhouse gas emissions. This other map is a little bit similar, but it's different. Instead of measuring the total amount of CO2 emissions for a country, it's measuring the emissions per inhabitant, per person. And that's interesting because this one tells us a bit more about our lifestyles and how our lifestyles as individuals contribute to the climate crisis. And when you divide it by person, the US it's not super clear on this map, but the US, as per the last numbers, are actually #1. So no one in the world emits more CO2 as an American. China is still very high, but because China has so many inhabitants, they're #1 when you look at the total amount of emissions of the country, but when you look at the emissions per person, they're a bit lower. So what do you see between the two maps? Well, very clearly, some countries are just always very light on those two maps. Like most parts of Africa are not really emitting a lot of CO2. Latin America is lighter than the rest of the world. A big part of Asia is also much lighter than the rest of the world. Now we're going to look at the countries that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so this is a map that measures vulnerability to climate change by looking at the potential impacts of climate change on food, water, health, ecosystem service, human habitat, and infrastructure. So for each of these parameters, it's looking at the ability of the country to respond to the impacts of climate change. And I think it's pretty obvious that it's almost the opposite of the maps on the left. You can see here that the dark red means very vulnerable, and most of Africa is very dark red. Pretty much the countries that haven't contributed to climate change that you can see on the left. Some parts of Latin America are more vulnerable, and also a big part of Asia. So it's almost a reverse relationship between the people who contributed the most to climate change. Basically, the people who contributed the most to climate change are the ones who are the least affected by the impacts. Just to give you another example of what it means to be affected differently by climate change, on the left, you can see the Bull of Wall Street that many of you probably know in New York. And on the right, you can see Kiribati, which is an island state between Hawaii and Australia, which has 32 low-lying atolls and 1 raised island. And the average altitude of the whole country is 2 meters above sea level. So now with our current level of emissions, if we keep going the way we're going, we're likely going to be, well, we might reach 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. With 4 degrees of warming, this is what New York would look like. So as you can see, we're losing pretty much 1 floor, like the first floor, the ground floor of the buildings. But this is not likely to happen anyway, because New York City has a lot of resources and will likely be able to build giant dikes or do whatever it takes to protect, especially downtown Manhattan, Wall Street, right, where the money is. Now let's look at what happens in Kiribati if we reach 3.5 or 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Basically, the country disappears. The whole country doesn't exist anymore. So as you can see, there's obviously not the same level of stakes in the crisis for people from Kiribati and from people from New York. Another example, it's not just about sea level rise, even though we talk a lot about that, but it's also just having to face more extreme events on a regular basis. So on the left is a picture of Bangladesh. This was not even after a particularly strong rainfall, but just a normal event during the rainy season and the streets flood. So imagine if this is a normal rain, imagine what happens as the rains are becoming more and more intense with climate change. On the right is the Philippines in 2020 after Typhoon Vamco, which led to 231,000 people to be evacuated and over 100 people killed. So with all that in mind, the governments around the world are trying to find a solution, right? And so you probably have heard that there are climate negotiations going on once a year, except last year when it was canceled because of COVID. And governments are coming together for these climate negotiations, and they're trying to find a solution. The most famous thing that came out of these negotiations so far was the Paris Agreement in 2015, which you might have heard of, in which all the countries agreed to collaborate to reduce the emissions to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees by the end of the century. The pictures we looked at were 3.5 or 4 degrees of increase. The Paris Agreement says we have to stay under 2 degrees and if possible under 1.5, because that would allow small island states like Kiribati to stay literally above water. They also agreed on mechanisms to share the costs of mitigation, which is reducing the emissions, and the costs of adaptation to support the most vulnerable nations. All of that following a principle that is called common but differentiated responsibility. So when they first started to talk about climate change at the United Nations in 1992, they created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. In 1992, when they wrote that text, they wrote the sentence that's in yellow that says, the parties, so the countries, should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So the common but differentiated responsibilities basically means we all have a responsibility to address climate change, but we know that not everybody has contributed the same. We understand that developed countries are developed because they were able to emit a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere that led them to where they are now, to being wealthier. And developing countries haven't done that. And so it's not fair to now tell them, well, you're not allowed to put CO2 in the atmosphere, and so you can't develop. We can't do that. It's not fair. It's not equitable. So we're recognizing that. And because of that, and we also recognize that because they haven't developed as much and they're not as wealthy, they don't have the same capabilities to adapt to the current impacts of climate change and to invest in cleaner developments. So there's this responsibility from the polluters, from the developed countries, to support developing countries in doing that. So is it working? You might have heard that some of you might know that a few weeks ago, we had another one of those climate negotiations in Glasgow in the UK. And it was the 26th edition of those negotiations. And I was there, I go everywhere every year. And every year, my friends ask me like, what, is it still working? We're at number 26. Does that mean that it's working or not? So we're not yet where we need to be, for sure. That's a given, but there's definitely been some notable progress. And this year in the text, actually, there were a lot of small wins, and all of those wins are in very big parts due to the massive and increasing pressure that we see from youth, from indigenous communities, from civil society, and from the most vulnerable countries. Obviously, all of these actors were always present, but there's really an increasing recognition of the fact that we need to listen to those people. And, we've had enough of the decisions that are taken by just a handful of the most powerful, the wealthier people. So the text has never been as inclusive as it was this year. It's the first time, it's the first time that the text was that inclusive, recognizing things like indigenous communities or mentioning fossil fuels in the text. And for the joke, one delegation in Glasgow this year actually said that for the first time, it's not the media that they're the most afraid of at COP, it's the youth. Because youth with the Friday for the Future movement, youth all around the world really made that their own issue, gathered, read some resources, made some specific demands, and are asking that basically their future is taken more seriously than that. So this really has an impact on the negotiation. We've really seen the difference of that massive increasing pressure. Just to finish on another positive note, this is just a graph showing a number of the social change wins in the history on a number of topics. And we just wanted to show that because basically none of those wins happened because the government decided that we need those changes. In every single case that you see on the graph, it happened because people came together as a community and decided that something had to change. And so here we have interracial marriage, prohibition, women's suffrage, abortion, same-sex marriage, recreational marijuana. We don't have anything about climate or environmental change. Hopefully this is the next thing that's going to show up on the graph with all the movement, all the gathering and the community and the fighting that we're seeing around the world on climate to ask for more accountability on climate change. So yeah.
And I can add a little bit to that. If you recall, back in 2019, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'm so used to calling her AOC that I don't even remember her full name. But she proposed the Green New Deal, which is really a rift off of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation to address the Great Depression, after the Great Depression, to help lift the country out of that. So Green New Deal is supposed to also create a lot of overlapping public policy to address climate change, as well as social economic injustices that have been ongoing in this country for a very long time. And it acknowledged that understanding that all of these injustices are overlapping, and we can't really solve one problem without solving the others. You can't just tell people to stop driving their cars or stop using fossil fuels without providing green jobs, without providing the alternatives to green alternative energy that is affordable, that is available to where people are. And so hopefully with understanding, acknowledging the history, we're able to move forward, as Melody mentioned, by the people voting into place their representatives, so that would actually represent their interests, that would acknowledge the historical injustices, and that would try to correct for this with future legislations.
Yeah, the youth this year at COP had a motto that said, "Nothing about us without us." So anything that you're going to discuss that's about us, we have to be included. And it's not just the youth, it's everybody else. If you're going to discuss something, involve the people that are impacted by the decision. So that's it for us. We hope you found it interesting, and we'd like to open the floor to questions or discussion, any comment that you may have.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. For now, I will kind of kick us off if people are thinking about it. You know, the native land acknowledgement that you did at the beginning, which I'm going to put a link in the chat here so that people can check it out themselves. It seems like a kind of an easy way we can just kind of begin to acknowledge some of these historic injustices. And I'm wondering, you know, as students or researchers, are there other ways that we can work to be more sensitive to some of these issues and ensure that we're really considering the history and the needs of the communities that we're studying or working in?
Yeah, I can jump in, and then Danny, feel free to add. I would say there are a lot of ways especially in research where we see these questions being raised. So research, and particularly scientific research, tends to be very extractive. So we get research grants, and then we go to a place and we collect data from people. And so it's very common to go to communities and you know, you run surveys or you do focus group discussions and you collect your information and then you leave. And then those communities never see the results of what they were questioned about, interrogated about. And so there's now more and more discussions about, well, about the importance of going back and actually not just extracting information from the communities, but really involving them throughout the research process. At the very least, communicate the results with them. But we've seen in a lot of the projects that we develop, and for example, I can think of, like, I work on climate risk insurance. The projects that end up being successful are the ones that really involve the local communities and the people that eventually are going to use the tools that we develop from the very beginning, from the design phase, instead of sitting here in New York with our own perception of the situation, designing a solution that's based on our perception, going to the country and maybe completely missing the points. So it's really, I think there's more and more awareness of the necessity of really involving local communities as part of the process from the very beginning as equal partners, and also to pay them for their contributions, to not just assume that they would be interested in working with us because our work is so great, you know, and like actually recognizing their contributions.
Yeah, and that's always the key, is to think about, you know, who are the people involved, to think of the stakeholders, and any issues that you're learning, you're studying, or you're working on. Is really essential to think about who is it for, you know, when you're designing a solution, and who is it designed by, who is it for, like, and who is it taking from. So asking all of these questions mean that you're trying to consider, you know, from a lot of different angles. So for example, I mentioned, you know, the highways that have cut through historically Black and people of color communities. You know, it's not, the answer isn't so simple as like tearing down these highways and then trying to return everything back to normal. Over time, people have developed to live in this area. So, you know, because there's no trees, people would hang out under the bridge, or to host or to sell, you know, merchants would like come and like sell their stuff there, or like kids, you know, would like go and like play under the bridge because this is the only place you can find shade. So if you're just tearing down the highway, you're continuing the constructions and the noise and creating all the same problems, and you're taking away the only shades that these communities have. So like, for example, an alternative proposal that people would say is that you could turn these highways into parks, so you don't let the cars go through, but you would turn it into like you know, an area that similar to what we have is the green, the High Line. You know, instead of tearing down these old railways, we create them parts out of them, so people can actually spend time, enjoy, and you know, like create a streets turn the streets back to the people rather than cars, and you know, people who just pass by. So yeah, I would say that, like, just considering the stakeholders and asking the questions are very important.
Thank you for that. That's really good answers. Another question, just, the maps that you showed showing the most vulnerable countries to climate change versus the ones that are most responsible were really striking. And so I wonder, particularly with some of these small island states where they're threatened by sea level rise, in some of these climate negotiations, are countries addressing concerns about people who might be displaced? Where will those people go if things get really bad?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it is being discussed, and it's also a very, very tricky issue, as you can imagine, because countries like Tuvalu or Kiribati or some of those small island states, or some that are not even, there's also a level of inequality or like misrepresentation within the small island states, because there's some, as I learned recently myself, that are not even represented in the UNFCCC process. But they are basically they have started a while ago to negotiate with other countries to purchase land where they might have to relocate when if their country ends up disappearing. But this is very linked to what is called the issue of loss and damage. Basically, at the negotiations, we talk about mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We talk about adaptation, which is adapting as much as possible to the existing impacts. But we also recognize that it's too late. Even if we mitigate and even if we adapt, there's some things that are going to be lost anyways, and that's loss and damage. And the most vulnerable countries are really asking for recognition and funding around loss and damage. Loss and damage was included in the Paris Agreement, but with the specific mention that it shouldn't include liability or compensation, exactly because some countries, including the US, are very afraid of what that would mean legally if a country says, well, my losses and damages are that my country's disappearing and I need to relocate a couple million people and you need to pay for it because you're responsible. So people are very scared of that. It is being discussed. There are a lot of discussions about displacement. Climate migration is not really recognized as it's not like a climate refugee is not yet a recognized official status. It is complicated because people don't migrate only for climate reasons, except maybe in the case of small island states, but everywhere else, people migrate for a number of reasons, very much socio-economic. And it's not just climate, but also we have seen that the socio-economic reasons that may push people to migrate are hard to distinguish from climate issues. Like we've seen how interconnected all of these issues are. So it makes it very difficult to separate, to like label a specific migration. And that's why it's so difficult to make progress on that in the US, but in the negotiations. But there are working groups within the negotiations that are working on that. And there's also internal migration. There are countries like Bangladesh, for example, that says that with sea level rise, potentially 30 million people living on the coastline might have to migrate either somewhere else or within Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, so they don't have a lot of space. So when people migrate internally, they go to the capital, they live in a slum, there's already one person per square meter, so there's really not much space. And so the government, along with some researchers, are trying to prepare smaller cities in Bangladesh to the influx of new people and trying to be ready to include them as part of the workforce and basically as an advantage for the city, instead of having them join and settle in informal settlements and slums where they are struggling and they're more of a burden for the city. So thinking about how to make the city ready to welcome those people and how they can readily contribute to the workforce.
Great, thank you. Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank, oh wait, looks like we got another question coming in, so let's try to squeeze this one in too, actually. From David, the pandemic has hit everybody, but more so disadvantaged people. Have community leaders used this lesson of the pandemic to advance environmental policies?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Well, I think for the climate negotiations, for example, that's something that was really brought up in a sense that one of the massive disappointments of where we are in the negotiations is, one, the lack of ambition from developed countries, but two, developed countries have promised $100 billion a year to developing countries to support adaptation and mitigation. And $100 billion is not that much money when you compare to a lot of things, and still hasn't been met. We haven't been able to provide that money. And so now developing countries are saying, look, this is becoming a trust issue. When you look at how the pandemic was managed, and you look at how much money was invested in the pandemic, but also how unequal the response to the pandemic was. And, you know, even to access the climate negotiations, you needed to have access to vaccines, and a lot of the countries didn't really have access to vaccines. And then there were a lot of issues with quarantining in a hotel that you had to pay for depending on where you came from. And obviously all the countries that were on the red list that had to quarantine for 2 weeks, which was something like $3,000 per person, all of those are, most of those were the most vulnerable countries. So the response to the pandemic was really used as an argument in the climate negotiations this year to say, we've had enough. We see that when you want to mobilize money, you can do it, but we've seen that it's still not done in an equitable way. So I would say that's one of the ways that the pandemic has been reflected in the negotiations. I don't know, Dannie, if you had a...
Yeah, and I could bring it back to New York City a little bit. You know, because we do have, as a city and as a state, we do have a lot of money, I guess, like federal money, state money, but also like, you know, private interest to try to create plans to address climate impacts. But the pandemic brought to the forefront, you know, these very vulnerable communities that are essential workers, you know, who we identify as essential workers during pandemic, also face disproportionate impacts from climate change because they live in areas within the cities that are more vulnerable to climate impacts like flooding and heat and other energy, power loss, power outages compared to a more affluent individual or like more affluent family. And they have to commute the longest to get to where they live, and if they rely on public transportations or something that would be the first to be taken down in case anything happens to the city. They don't have a car, so like let's say there's an evacuation order, they can't get out of the city, or they can't get out of the areas that are flooded or impacted as quickly as someone who owned a car. And then there's a lot of poor families or undocumented families who cannot find, regulated housing, so they end up in illegal, unregulated basement apartments that, as you've seen with Hurricane Ida, were entirely flooded. People lost everything they owned, they lost their home, but also they cannot easily seek compensation or assistance from the government because, the homes that they lived in were not, documented or legal to begin with. So it brings these injustices and the disproportionate impacts to the forefront. So then the city can actually see and recognize these impacts better and try to address them with the local community, with the people who are most impacted in mind.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but
actually I have one more plug because I want to mention it. We mentioned in the beginning that Melody and I are part of a committee at IRI to try to bring climate education and events and workshops and activities more to students and to communities around New York City who are historically marginalized. So we did develop a lot of resources in the meantime while we're doing these activities, and they are available to teachers and anyone who wants to learn or who wants to transfer this knowledge forward. And so you can find our website and reach out and contact us if you're interested in any of these materials we've developed. We're happy to assist you.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. The recording should be available on the website later this week. This is our last K-12 session of 2021, but we will be back in the new year. Our next session will be on January 13th. And if you're interested, you can find links to register for all of the sessions on the Climate School website. So thank you to everybody for joining us, and have a good day.
Thank you to Adrienne for hosting.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.